Wyoming, January 1888. A Boston woman in a crimson velvet dress kneels in the snow with a 15-pound buffalo rifle pressed against her shoulder. Her husband is bleeding out at her feet. 40 hired guns are riding hard at the cabin. The sheriff who killed her father is galloping free, and 200 yards up the cliff sits one stick of dynamite that nobody else can reach. She has one shot, and she has never fired this rifle in her life. Folks, let me tell you how a woman everyone in Boston had forgotten became the woman a mountain decided to keep. The wind in the Absaroka Mountains did not whisper. It hunted, it searched for weakness in every seam of leather, every crack in every cabin wall, every soft place in a man's spirit. In the autumn of 1887, that wind ruled the high country of Wyoming Territory, and it was teaching one particular man how heavy a single coffee cup could feel at 4 o'clock in the morning. Caleb Mercer sat at his rough pine table with both hands wrapped around a tin mug. Steam rose from the bitter coffee and curled into the rafters where smoke from 5 winters had stained the wood the color of old leather. He was 31 years old. He stood 6 feet 6 inches in his stocking feet. His shoulders filled a doorway. The frost in his dark chestnut hair had not come from age. It had come from the cabin window where the cold pressed in and refused to be denied. His hand shook, just a little, just enough. It was not the cold that made it shake. He had stood naked to the waist in worse weather than this splitting wood until steam rose off his shoulders like he was a furnace. It was not fear. He had stared down a wounded grizzly with nothing but a hatchet, and his hand had been steady as granite. It was the memory. It was always the memory. 5 years had passed since the winter of 1882. 5 years since he had carried his wife Eliza out into the dawn with her cheeks already cold. 5 years since he had wrapped his son Jonas, 4 years old and small enough to hold in one arm in his mother's wedding quilt. The fever had come in 3 days. It had taken them in 3 more. He had dug their graves himself under the old ponderosa pine behind the cabin, breaking the frozen earth with a pickaxe for 6 hours while his hands bled inside his gloves. He had not let his brother help. Some things a man does alone, or he does not do them at all. That night after the burial, he had sat at this same table with his Colt revolver loaded and laid across his knee. He had stared at the lamp until the oil burned low. He had been thinking very calmly about what came next. He did not remember deciding to live. He only remembered hearing his brother's voice from the barn. Silas had been 26, then still moving easy on both legs, no limp yet. The voice had come muffled through the snow. "Caleb, you still out here, brother?" That was all. 5 words. They had kept him at the table until morning, and morning had come, and the revolver had gone back in its holster, and a man who had wanted to die had become a man who simply waited. The waiting had been the hardest part. Old Jeb's voice settles over this moment like dust on a porch rail. Now, folks, I want you to understand something before we go further. The deepest fear a man carries is not the fear of dying. A man my age, your age, we have made peace with the idea of dying. The fear that wakes a man at 4 in the morning is the fear of dying alone. No hand to hold, no names spoken, just a cabin gone cold and a body the snow finds before anyone else does. Caleb Mercer knew that fear better than he knew his own face in a shaving mirror, and that is why in the September of 1887 he did something he had sworn for 5 years he would never do. He sat down at the same pine table and he wrote a letter. The letter had been short, 6 lines. He had used his best ink and his best paper, which was to say he had used ink that was only half dried out and paper that had only 1 tea stain on it. He had folded it carefully and sealed it with candle wax and walked it 3 days down the mountain to the post office at South Pass City, where a clerk named Henrik had looked at the address and tried not to smile. The advertisement had run in the matrimonial news for 6 weeks. Wanted, a virtuous young woman of refined character to become wife of frontier rancher. Wyoming Territory, quiet life in the high country, honest man, honest home, signed only with 2 initials. Caleb took another swallow of the bitter coffee. It had gone cold. He had not noticed. The cabin door opened on its leather hinge, and Silas came in with a bundle of pine kindling under one arm and snow on his shoulders. He moved with the slight hitch that had lived in his right leg since the mine collapse at Leadville 3 years ago. The Mercer brothers were twins born 20 minutes apart, identical from the auburn streaks in their hair to the whiskey amber of their eyes. The only sure way to tell them apart was the long, pale scar that ran across Silas's left cheekbone, a souvenir from a falling timber that had nearly killed him in the dark of that mine. Silas dropped the kindling by the stove and rubbed his hands together. He looked at his brother's coffee. He looked at his brother's face. You did not sleep, Silas said. I slept some. You did not sleep at all. I checked on the mare at midnight. The lamp was burning. Caleb did not answer. Silas pulled the second tin mug from the shelf and poured himself coffee from the iron pot on the stove. He sat down across from his brother and looked at him over the rim of the cup. Twins know each other the way no two other people in this world know each other. They had shared a womb, a cradle, a bed until they were 12 and a war against grief for 5 winters. Now Silas did not need words to understand what was sitting behind Caleb's eyes this morning. She is coming, Silas said. Tomorrow. The stage from Cheyenne reaches South Pass City around dusk. You ready, brother? Caleb stared into his cold coffee. No, he said. Silas almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that a man earns only by surviving things he cannot speak about. He set down his cup. Then we work today? Silas said we work until you are too tired to think. We finish the back wall chinking. We bring in another cord of wood. We clean the second room. By dusk tomorrow, this place will be ready for a woman from Boston who has never set foot west of the Mississippi River, and you will be too sore to remember why you were afraid. That is how we get through this, the same way we have always gotten through everything. Caleb looked up at his brother. What if she takes one look at me and gets back on the stage, he said. Then she gets back on the stage, Silas said. And you and I keep doing what we have been doing for 5 years. We keep waking up, we keep splitting wood, we keep waiting for the day Jubal Holloway makes one mistake too many. That is the worst that happens. Brother, the worst that happens is that nothing changes. He paused and his voice softened. But maybe it does change, Caleb. Maybe she gets off that stage and she does not run. Maybe she stays. And maybe one day you stop sitting at this table at 4 a.m. Did you ever think on that? Caleb did not answer because he could not. Some hopes a man does not say out loud, not even to his twin, because saying them might break them. 2,000 miles east, in a narrow boarding house on Joy Street, on the back of Beacon Hill, a young woman named Cordelia Hartwell stood at her window and watched 3 men walk past on the cobblestones for the second time that day. She was 22 years old. Her hair was the color of wildflower honey pinned up in a loose Victorian twist with soft tendrils curling around her temples. Her eyes were a deep cornflower blue, the kind of blue that made strangers look twice and then look away because they had not earned the right to look longer. Her skin was the porcelain fair of a girl who had grown up reading in libraries instead of working in fields. She was small. She stood 5 feet 3 inches in her stocking feet. Her waist was narrow under the deep crimson velvet of the traveling dress she had been wearing for 3 days now. Her mother had called her Della from the day she was born, and the name had stuck. Most people who met Della Hartwell underestimated her by about 30 seconds. After 30 seconds, when they had heard her speak, they stopped underestimating her. She watched the 3 men pass the boarding house door. The man in the gray coat looked up at her window. He did not see her. She had stepped behind the curtain in time, but she had seen him. And she had seen the way his hand rested too easily on the bulge under his coat. And she had seen the way his eyes counted the windows. 3 days, she thought. They have been watching this boarding house for 3 days. Della turned from the window. The cedar trunk sat at the foot of her narrow iron bed. It was the only thing she would take west. Her father's name was carved into the lid in small, neat letters. H. Hartwell, Boston, 1862. The trunk had been a wedding gift to her mother. Inside it, beneath 3 dresses and a small frame daguerreotype and a Bible with a broken spine, was a false bottom her father had built with his own hands. Beneath that false bottom was a ledger bound in calfskin. The ledger weighed 7 pounds. It had killed her father. Hollis Hartwell had been a man of small ambitions and great honesty. He had been an accountant for 31 years, first for the Boston and Maine Railroad, and then beginning in 1885 for a shipping concern called Hartford and Holloway Limited. The pay had been good. The hours had been quiet. He had told his daughter that first month that he liked the work because the numbers always added up. For 2 years, they had added up. Then in the spring of 1887, they had stopped adding up. Della had been the one to notice it first because she had been the one keeping her father's correspondence in order while he worked late. She had seen the discrepancies between the shipping manifest and the receipts. She had seen the payments to men in Wyoming Territory with names she had never heard in amounts that no shipping company would ever pay. She had brought it to her father. He had told her to forget she had ever seen it. He had not forgotten. That was the trouble. Hollis Hartwell had been a quiet man and an honest man, and an honest man cannot unsee what he has seen. For 3 months, he had quietly copied entries, cross-referenced dates, traced money through 3 banks back to a single name. He had built a case that could send a powerful man to the gallows. In July of 1887, he had finished the ledger. He had hidden it in the cedar trunk under the false bottom. Before he had hidden it, he had sat his daughter down at the kitchen table one evening, and he had shown it to her by lamplight. He had made her memorize three things: the names of the men, the amount of the bribes, and the gold ring on Jubal Holloway's right hand the size of a hazelnut. If anything happens to me, Della, her father had said quietly, you have to recognize that man on sight. There will be no second chance. The ring is how you will know him. Remember the ring. She had remembered the ring. In August, he was dead. The newspapers called it a carriage accident on Tremont Street. The driver of the second carriage had never been found. The horses had been the wrong horses. The witnesses had been the wrong witnesses. Della had stood at her father's grave and known, with the calm certainty of a young woman who has read too many novels and not enough lies, that her father had been murdered. The men outside her window were proof. She crossed the small room and lifted the lid of the cedar trunk. The newspaper she had bought at the kiosk that morning lay folded on top of her clothes. She unfolded it now and read again the advertisement she had circled in pencil 3 weeks ago. Wanted, a virtuous young woman of refined character, quiet life in the high country, honest man, honest home. She had sent her letter the same afternoon. She had received a reply 12 days later, and inside the envelope had been a stage ticket to Cheyenne and $50 in folded bills. The letter accompanying it had been short, 5 lines, plain handwriting, the same 2 initials on the signature: C.M. Mountain Mercer Ranch, Dead Man's Drop, Absaroka County, Wyoming. Dead Man's Drop. Even the name should have warned her. But Della Hartwell had stood at her father's grave and made him a promise, and the only way to keep that promise was to get to Wyoming alive with the ledger. She closed the trunk, she locked it, she put the small brass key on the chain around her neck where it had lived for 3 months now. She sat down on the edge of the bed and breathed slowly until her hands stopped trembling. The train left Boston the following morning at 6:15. She did not know it yet, but on the same night she sat in that boarding house counting heartbeats until dawn 2,000 miles west. A man named Caleb Mercer was carrying a freshly chopped cord of wood into a cabin he had built with his brother 5 years ago. He was tired in the bone-deep way that quiets the mind. For the first time in many months, when he lay down on his bunk that night, he did not sit up at 4 a.m. He slept and he dreamed of nothing at all. The mountain had decided to give him that one mercy. Old Jeb's voice returned slow and warm as a hand on a tired shoulder. Folks, I have been telling stories around stoves and campfires for 40-some years, and I have learned one thing about the way the Lord works in this world. He does not always rescue, but he does sometimes arrange. He arranged a meeting that autumn. A man in Wyoming who had stopped sleeping, a woman in Boston who had stopped trusting, a ledger that weighed 7 pounds, and a mountain that had been waiting, 3 threads. The Lord was about to pull them tight into a single rope, and that rope was going to hang Jubal Holloway, but it was going to cost everything in this world worth keeping cost something. You know that. I know that. They were about to find out. The journey took 8 days. Della saw mountains for the first time on the morning of the 4th day when the train climbed into the foothills west of Omaha. She pressed her hand flat against the cold window and watched them come up over the horizon like something out of a hymn. She had read about mountains. She had seen them in engravings in her father's books. Nothing had prepared her for the actual sight of them, the way they made her chest feel small and her breathing slow. She arrived at Cheyenne on the evening of the 6th day and slept in a railway hotel with her trunk locked and pushed against the door of her room. She did not undress. She lay on top of the covers in her crimson dress with her hand resting on the brass key at her throat. The stagecoach to South Pass City left at dawn. It was a battered Concord coach with the springs gone soft on the left side, and the driver was a leather-faced man who spat tobacco juice every 14 seconds with metronomic regularity. Della sat between a fur trader from St. Louis who smelled of beaver oil and a Methodist preacher who read his Bible aloud for the first 3 hours. Across from her sat a woman in her early 50s with iron gray hair, pinned in a tight knot, wearing a wool dress the color of slate and a black widow's cape across her shoulders. The woman watched Della for nearly an hour before she spoke. She had pale blue eyes that did not miss anything. "You are going to South Pass City," the woman said. It was not a question. Della nodded carefully. "You are not staying in South Pass City," the woman said. It was also not a question. "I am meeting someone," Della said. The woman nodded once slowly as though Della had confirmed something she had already known. Her gaze moved to the crimson dress and then to the brass key at Della's throat and then back to Della's face. "My name is Beatrice Whitmore," the woman said. "I keep the boarding house at South Pass City. I have kept it for 19 years. I have watched a great many young women get off this stagecoach. I have watched some of them go to good lives and some to bad ones. I have learned to tell the difference in about 4 minutes." I am sorry, Della said. I do not know what to say to that. You do not have to say anything. I'm going to give you some advice instead. May I? Della nodded. In South Pass City, Beatrice Whitmore said, "Do not trust any man who wears a badge. Do not trust any man who wears a gold ring. The two men you should be most careful of are the mayor and the sheriff. Their names are Jubal Holloway and Edmund Pierce. Remember those names. They will be the first faces you see when this stage rolls in. You will not have time to learn them later." Della's hand drifted up to the brass key at her throat without her meaning it to. Beatrice Whitmore's eyes followed the motion. "You have something they want," Beatrice said quietly. "I do not need to know what. I will only say that if it ever happens that you need help in a hurry, send a telegram to this name and this address. Do not write your own name on it. Sign it Mary Jane." She passed Della a small folded square of paper. Della took it and put it inside her glove without looking at it. Beatrice nodded once. "Why are you helping me?" Della asked. Beatrice Whitmore looked out the coach window for a long moment at the gray Wyoming landscape rolling past. "I had a daughter once," she said. "She would have been about your age." She did not say anything else. Della did not ask. The stage rolled into South Pass City at dusk. Della stepped down onto the muddy boards of the main street, and the cold hit her like a slap. Snow had begun to fall. The small, hard kind that meant a real storm coming. The street was wider than she had expected and emptier. 3 frame buildings on the right, a general store, a saloon called the Silver Spur, and a stable. On the left, the jail and the bank and what looked like a livery. 20 men stood watching the stagecoach. Some leaned in the saloon doorway. Some stood under the awning of the store. None of them moved. No one came forward to meet her. She set her cedar trunk down beside her in the snow and pulled her cape tighter and tried to look as though she had been expected, as though a man would walk out of one of these buildings any moment now and tip his hat and call her by name. The seconds stretched. The men kept watching. The door of the Silver Spur opened, and a large man stepped out into the snow. He was perhaps 55 years old. He was wearing a beaver coat that must have cost $200. He was wearing a gold ring on his small finger the size of a hazelnut. His face was red with whiskey, and his smile was wide and easy, and Della felt her stomach turn over before he spoke a word. Behind him came a smaller man with a polished tin badge on his coat and a face like a hatchet. "Boys," the large man said, his voice carrying easily across the street so that everyone could hear. "Look at this." A Boston rose in the snow. "My dear young lady, did you come west in your grandmother's curtains?" A few men laughed in the saloon doorway. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Della felt the heat rise into her face. She did not let it show. She lifted her chin a quarter of an inch and looked the large man directly in the eye. "I came west to meet my intended sir," she said. Her voice was clear and quiet and did not shake. "Your intended," the large man repeated. He drew the word out as though tasting it. And who would that be, my dear?" "Mr. Caleb Mercer," Della said. The street went silent. It was a particular kind of silence. It was the silence of 20 men who had been about to laugh, deciding all at once that they were not going to laugh after all. Even the men in the saloon doorway moved a half step back into the shadow. The large man's smile did not change, but his eyes did. They went flat and small and dark. Beside him, the sheriff with the badge took a step forward and tipped his hat with the false courtesy of a man about to do something cruel. "That is unfortunate, ma'am," the sheriff said. "The Mercer brothers do not come down off their mountain, not for visitors, not for letters, not for stages. They have not come into this town for 3 months now. I am afraid you have been the victim of a poor joke. Perhaps you should come with me to the jailhouse. We have a stove. We can get you a warm cup of coffee while we figure out what to do with you." Della did not move. She did not answer. She had recognized the gold ring on the large man's finger the moment she saw it. Her father had described it for her so many times that she could have drawn it from memory. Mayor Jubal Holloway, South Pass City, Wyoming Territory, the man who had ordered her father's death. She was looking at her father's killer, and her father's killer was inviting her to walk willingly into a jail cell. Far away, very faintly, she heard the slow, steady sound of hoofbeats. 2 horses coming up the main street from the south, coming slow and unhurried the way men ride when they are in no particular hurry because the world will wait for them to arrive. Old Jeb's voice slips in here like the first cold draft under a door. Folks, I want you to picture this carefully, because what happens in the next 60 seconds is the moment everything in this story changes. A woman from Boston standing in the snow in a crimson dress, 20 men watching, a mayor with a gold ring smiling like a wolf, a sheriff already reaching for her elbow. And from the south end of Main Street, the sound of 2 horses coming. 2 horses, friends, not 1, 2. Mayor Holloway's eyes flicked up the street. The smile slipped on his face for the first time. The sheriff's hand paused 2 inches from Della's arm. Two riders came out of the falling snow. They were both very tall, and they were both wearing long bear hide coats the color of charcoal, and they were both carrying Winchester rifles laid across their saddles. They rode the same kind of black Mustang horse, large and quiet-footed, and they rode at the same easy pace with their hats pulled low against the snow, and they were absolutely and unmistakably the same man twice. Della stared. She had been told nothing about a brother. She had been told nothing about a twin. The letter had said only CM, and she had assumed CM was one man, one signature, one husband. There were two men coming down the street. The man on the left swung down off his horse a few yards from her. The man on the right stayed mounted slightly behind his Winchester, now angled across his saddle in a way that was not quite pointed at the sheriff, but was not pointed away either. The smaller man with the badge stepped back a careful half step. The dismounted rider walked up to Della and stopped 2 paces away. He took off his hat. He had dark chestnut hair with sun-streaked highlights slightly tousled and whiskey-amber eyes set deep under a strong brow. His face was weather-burned and roughly handsome in the way that mountains are roughly handsome, which is to say not in the way that a city woman is taught to look for. A 3-day stubble shadowed his jaw. He was even taller than she had thought from a distance. Miss Hartwell, he said. His voice was low and rough and slow as molasses in cold weather. I apologize for the delay, ma'am. The Lander Pass road was drifted shut. We came around the long way. Della found her voice on the second try. Mr. Mercer, she said. He gave a small nod. Caleb, ma'am, if you please. He looked once at her cedar trunk in the snow. Something in his face shifted very slightly when he saw it, though he did not comment. Then he turned slowly and for the first time looked directly at Mayor Jubal Holloway. It was the kind of look that empties a room, Mayor Caleb Mercer said. The word was quiet. It was almost polite. Mayor, I believe my wife and I have business up the mountain. I would not want to keep her standing in the cold. Holloway's smile reset itself with visible effort. Mercer, he said, I had no idea you were expecting company. Allow me to be the first to congratulate you. Of course. The young lady is free to go. The sheriff was only offering her shelter from the storm. I am sure he was, Caleb said. He held Holloway's eyes for one extra heartbeat, just one. Then he bent and lifted Della's cedar trunk as though it weighed nothing, which Della knew for a fact it did not. He turned and walked it to where his brother was waiting with a third horse on a lead rein, a small bay mare with quiet eyes. He lashed the trunk behind the saddle with 2 leather thongs. In the time it took Della to take 3 breaths, his brother, still mounted, finally spoke. Ma'am, the brother said. He tipped his hat. He had the same voice as Caleb, but he used it slightly differently with a touch of warmth around the edges. Silas Mercer. My brother's twin. He has the manners. I have the singing voice. I am sorry he did not mention me in his letter. He is shy on paper. Della laughed. It came out before she could stop it. It surprised her more than it surprised anyone else. It was the first time she had laughed in 3 months. Silas Mercer touched the brim of his hat as though her laughter had been a small gift he was accepting. Caleb came back for her. He stood at the bay mare's flank and held out his gloved hand. Up you go, ma'am, he said. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, and even through 2 pairs of gloves, she felt how careful he was. She felt how a man who could have crushed her fingers without trying instead held them as though they were made of glass. He lifted her into the saddle in one easy motion. Her crimson skirt settled around her legs. Caleb adjusted the stirrup for her without being asked and put the reins in her hand. Just hold on, ma'am. The mare knows the way. Her name is Hazel. Hazel, Della said. She managed to make it sound steady. As they turned their horses south, Beatrice Whitmore stepped quickly out of the saloon doorway and crossed the muddy street to Della's stirrup. She did not look at the Mercer brothers. She did not look at Holloway. She looked only at Della. Mary Jane Beatrice said quietly, remember. Della nodded. The folded paper was already inside her glove. The 3 horses moved off down the main street at a slow walk. Caleb rode at the front, Silas rode at the rear, Della rode in the middle on Hazel with her cedar trunk strapped behind her, and she did not look back because she could feel Mayor Jubal Holloway watching her go, and she did not want him to see her face. Behind them in the snow of Main Street, Holloway turned to his sheriff. Edmund, he said quietly, I want you to send a telegram tonight. Tonight, you understand me. To our friends in Boston, tell them the rabbit ran into the wolf's den. Tell them to increase the bounty, $200 extra on her head. I want her dead before Christmas. Sheriff Edmund Pierce nodded slowly. Mayor, he said, what about the Mercer boys? Holloway watched the 3 horses dwindle into the Falling snow at the south end of the street. The Mercer boys, he said softly, are about to have a very bad winter. Maybe their last winter. The girl is just the bait. Now the rats come to us, Edmund. All in one little cabin, all together. We have wanted those boys for 2 years. The Lord above has just delivered them. We will move when the snow gets deep enough that no marshal can ride. Late January, I think. Yes, late January will do nicely. He turned and walked back into the Silver Spur to finish his whiskey. The ride into the mountains took 3 days. By the end of the first hour, Della understood why no one came down from Dead Man's Drop. The trail climbed. It did not stop climbing. It crossed 3 frozen creeks where the horses had to pick their way over slick stones. It threaded between black walls of basalt where the wind funneled and shrieked like something hunting. The crimson velvet of her dress was not warm enough. She knew that within 20 minutes. She did not say a word. After 2 hours, Caleb stopped his horse. He swung down without explanation. He pulled from his saddlebag a heavy bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it. Inside was a thick gray wool cloak lined with beaver fur. He walked back to her stirrup and held it up to her without speaking. "For me," she said, "for you, ma'am, you will not survive the pass in what you are wearing. I did not know your size. I made it a little long." He paused. "I have been working on it since September." September. Della felt something move in her chest that she did not have a name for. He had been making her a cloak since September, since before he could have known whether she would even answer his letter. She let him settle the cloak around her shoulders. His hands were careful at her neck. His knuckles brushed the brass key on her throat for half a second, and then withdrew as though they had touched something precious. He did not ask about the key. He did not ask about anything. He simply made sure the wool hood was up over her hair and the front was buttoned to her chin. "Better," he said. "Better," she agreed. He swung back up onto his horse. They rode on. That night they made camp in a shallow cave under an overhang of rock. Silas built the fire. Caleb tended the horses. Della watched them work the way they moved around each other without speaking, without ever needing to ask which task was whose. Twins. She had not known any twins. She had not understood until now what it meant to grow up sharing one shadow. Silas cooked elk steaks in an iron skillet with a small pinch of salt and a handful of wild sage he pulled from a bundle in his saddlebag. He handed Della a plate. She had not realized how hungry she was until she smelled the meat. She ate without speaking. The 2 men ate in the same way. When the meal was done, Silas rolled himself up in a wool blanket near the fire and was asleep within 4 minutes. Caleb stayed up. He sat against a saddle with his Winchester across his knee, watching the dark beyond the firelight. After a while, Della rose from her own blanket and came to sit on the cold ground beside him, close enough to share the small radius of warmth. She was quiet for a long time. He let her be quiet. "Mr. Mercer," she said at last. "Caleb, ma'am." "Caleb, may I ask you a question that is not my place to ask? You may ask, ma'am. I may not answer." Della folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the fire instead of at his face. "Who was Mary?" she said. He did not answer for so long that she thought she had ruined everything in this single moment, that she had reached too far on the first night, and he would never speak to her again. The fire crackled. The wind moved high above them in the pines. Somewhere far down the valley, a wolf called once and was answered. "Eliza," he said finally. His voice was soft. "Her name was Eliza," he said, "not Mary. We were married in 1876. I was 20. She was 18. Our son's name was Jonas. He was 4 years old when the fever took them both. 3 days in February of 1882. I buried them under a ponderosa pine behind our cabin. That cabin is gone now. I burned it down the morning after I buried them. Silas and I built this one a few miles up the canyon. That is the whole of it, ma'am. There is not more to tell." Della felt the tears on her face before she knew she was crying. She did not wipe them away. She did not say she was sorry. She had heard too many people say they were sorry at her father's funeral, and not one of those sorries had helped. Instead, she reached out slowly and laid her small gloved hand on top of his much larger ungloved hand where it rested on the stock of the Winchester. He did not move. He did not look at her, but after a moment, very slowly, he turned his hand over under hers and let her fingers settle into his palm. They sat that way for a long time without speaking, while the fire burned low and the wolves moved somewhere far off in the dark. Old Jeb's voice comes in here, gentle, almost a whisper. Folks, 2 broken people, had just sat down side by side at a fire in the high country of Wyoming. Neither one of them knew it yet, but the Lord had been arranging this fire for 5 years. He had needed a father to die in Boston. He had needed a wife and a son to die in 1882. He had needed 2 twins to build a cabin. He had needed a mayor with a gold ring to grow careless. All of it. All of it for one hand to be laid on top of another hand on the stock of a Winchester rifle in the dark of the Wind River country. The Lord does not waste pain, friends. He does not always rescue, but he arranges. Oh, how he arranges. They arrived at the cabin at sundown on the third day. It was not what Della had been expecting. She had pictured a single broken down shack in a snowfield. What she found was a working homestead tucked back against the south wall of a hidden canyon, almost invisible from above. A 2-story cabin of squared pine logs with 3 stone chimneys giving up thin, white smoke. A barn, a horse corral, a small blacksmith's forge under a lean-to, a root cellar dug into the hillside. The place had the bones of a permanent home, built by 2 men who had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do but build well. Silas took the horses to the barn. Caleb carried Della's trunk through the cabin door. Inside the front room was warm. The fire was already burning, which meant someone had ridden ahead at some point in the past day, which meant the brothers had been planning the timing of her arrival down to the hour. A pine table, 2 ladder-back chairs, a black iron stove, shelves of dried herbs and books, 3 books on the top shelf. She noticed those. Caleb led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor and pushed open a door on the right. He stood back to let her enter alone. She stopped in the doorway. The room was small, a bed of pine logs neatly made up with a thick quilt of red and cream squares, a washstand with a porcelain pitcher, a small writing desk by the single window, a copper bathtub in one corner. On the desk, set out as though waiting for her for weeks, was a small bone china tea set, white with a thin gold rim, the kind a Boston grandmother might have owned. Silas, she heard Caleb say behind her quietly. He thought a Boston lady might miss her tea. He rode to Cheyenne and back in October for that set. 3 days each way. He said he wanted you to feel welcome. Della did not turn around. She could not turn around. She stood in the doorway of the small room and she pressed her hand against her mouth and she wept silently for the first time in 3 months. She wept for her father. She wept for the journey. She wept for 2 strange men in a cabin who had been making her a cloak in September and buying her a tea set in October when she had been only a name on an envelope. She wept because the mountain had not killed her. The mountain had brought her home. Behind her in the doorway, Caleb Mercer stood with his hat in both hands and did not say a word. He simply waited. Outside, the snow began to fall again on the high peaks. The first real storm of winter was on its way. And in a small lit room 600 miles east, a mayor with a gold ring on his finger was counting bounty money on a polished oak desk and making a list of 40 names. The mountain had taken in 3 souls now. The mountain would have to keep them. The mountain don't keep what it doesn't want, but what it keeps forever. And it had decided that snowy evening of November in 1887 to keep Cordelia Hartwell. The first morning at Dead Man's Drop, Della woke before the sun. She had not meant to. She had meant to sleep until someone came to wake her the way a guest in a strange house should. But 3 months of running had trained her body to flinch at every settling sound, and the cabin made many sounds, a log shifting in the stove downstairs, a horse shaking its harness in the barn, the wind testing the chinking between the logs of her wall and finding it good and moving on. She lay under the red and cream quilt and listened. Below her, very faintly, she heard the iron lid of the stove being lifted and set down. She heard the soft clink of a tin mug. She heard a man clear his throat, once the kind of sound a man makes when he has been awake for an hour already and is not expecting anyone else to be up. Della rose. She washed her face in the cold water from the porcelain pitcher. She dressed slowly in the second of the 3 dresses. She had brought a plain dark wool the color of slate. She pinned up her hair without a mirror, which was a skill she had learned in Boston and never expected to use in Wyoming. She paused at the door of her small room, then she opened it and went down the stairs. Caleb stood at the stove with his back to her. He was in shirt sleeves. His broad shoulders filled the homespun cotton. He was stirring something in a black iron pan. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the front room. He did not turn around when she came down. He had heard her on the stairs. "Good morning, Miss Hartwell." "Della?" He paused. He turned his head slightly. "Della. Good morning, Caleb." She stood at the foot of the stairs and did not quite know where to put herself. The cabin was small. The front room held the stove, the pine table, 2 chairs, and a stack of split firewood by the door. There was no place for her to be useful that he was not already standing in. He seemed to understand this. He nodded toward the table. "Sit." Coffee is ready. Silas is in the barn. He will come in when he smells the bacon. He always does. She sat. Caleb poured coffee into a second tin mug and set it in front of her. He did not ask how she took it. He set a small clay pot of honey beside the mug and a tin of fresh cream from the morning milking and a clean spoon. He had laid it out the way a man lays out things when he has been thinking carefully about a person he does not yet know. Thank you, she said. He gave a small nod and turned back to the bacon. For the next 20 minutes, they did not speak. It was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who had decided by mutual unspoken agreement that they had 3 days of mountain riding to recover from and that words could wait until breakfast was on the table. Silas came in from the barn with snow on his hat. He limped slightly as he crossed the threshold more than he had on the trail. The cold made the old mine wound stiffer in the mornings. He hung his hat on the peg by the door. He saw Della at the table and gave her a slow smile, the kind of smile that was easier in his face than in his brother's. Morning, Della. Morning, Silas. I see he has fed you bacon. That is a good sign. When my brother feeds a person, it means he intends to keep them. Caleb did not look up from the stove, but Della saw his shoulders move slightly the way a man's shoulders move when he has decided not to laugh. Silas, sit down. Eat. Silas sat down. They ate. Now, folks gather close to the stove for this next part. I want you to picture this carefully. A young woman from Boston in a plain wool dress sitting at a pine table in a cabin in Wyoming, eating bacon and biscuits with two mountain men who looked exactly alike. The wind was howling outside, the stove was warm, and for the first time in 3 months, that young woman ate with both hands and finished her plate. That is a small thing, friends. But small things tell you when a soul is starting to mend. Watch for the small things. They are how the Lord speaks. The days that followed taught Della the rhythm of the cabin. Caleb rose at 4. He fed the stove, ground the coffee, and was out the door to the barn by 4:30. Silas rose at 5 and walked his trap line before breakfast, returning with 1 or 2 snowshoe hair hanging from his belt, sometimes a beaver. The brothers met in the kitchen at 6:30. They ate. They worked. The work never stopped. It was the kind of work Della had read about in dime novels and never quite believed in, because in the dime novels, the work was always over by sundown. In real life, the work was waiting again at sunrise because the cold did not stop and the animals did not stop and the snow kept coming. Caleb worked with a double-bitted axe and a splitting maul. Della had not understood before she came west that there was a difference between an axe and a maul. She learned. Caleb explained it to her on the 3rd morning when she came out to the woodshed to bring him a tin cup of coffee. He had been splitting since dawn. His breath made clouds in the cold air. His shoulders moved in long, even arcs, and the wood split clean every time, and the air smelled of pine resin and cold and sweat. This is the axe, he said, holding it up. He paused for breath. You use this for cutting trees down. The blade is narrow. It bites deep. He set the axe aside and lifted the heavier tool. This is the maul. Heavier head, wider wedge. You use this for splitting rounds. The weight does the work. Most men try to swing it with their arms. The man who swings it with his arms is the man who quits at noon. You let gravity do the swinging. He turned a round of pine on its end on the splitting block. He lifted the maul and brought it down in one slow falling arc, and the round of pine split clean into 2 halves with a single sharp sound. She had never seen anyone work like that. She had grown up watching Boston men who measured exertion in beads of perspiration on a starched collar. Caleb worked the way the mountain worked, in long, unhurried motions that seemed slow until you noticed how much had been done. You are watching me, ma'am, he said without looking up. I am. Is something the matter? No, she said. Nothing is the matter at all. He glanced sideways at her then. There was the smallest movement at the corner of his mouth. It might have been a smile. It might only have been the wind. Silas worked differently. Silas worked with his hands close to his body. He skinned hairs at the kitchen table with a small, narrow blade, peeling the pelts off in single long pieces that he stretched on willow frames to cure. He repaired harness leather with an awl and waxed thread. He shoed horses in the lean to forge. He mended the chinking between the cabin logs with a knife and a wooden float and a bucket of clay mixed with chopped horsehair. Where Caleb's work was large and slow, Silas's work was small and quick. Della asked on the 4th morning if she could help. Silas looked up from the harness he was mending. He considered her for a long moment. Can you sew? He said. I can sew, plain stitch or fancy. Both. He nodded. He stood, limped to a wooden chest in the corner of the front room and lifted out a pile of clothing she had not seen before. 2 pairs of canvas work trousers, 3 flannel shirts, a heavy wool coat. All of them were torn or worn through in some place. He set the pile on the table in front of her with a small folding case of needles and thread. He has been wearing the same shirts for 3 years, Silas said quietly. I do not sew well enough to keep up with him. He will not buy new ones because he hates going to town. If you have a mind to help Della, this is where help would matter. Della looked at the pile of clothes. They smelled of pine smoke and lye soap and the man who had been wearing them. She picked up the topmost shirt. The collar had worn through to the lining. The cuffs were frayed. I will start with the collar, she said. She mended that shirt all morning at the pine table by the stove. She mended it carefully. When Caleb came in at noon, blowing on his hands, he stopped just inside the door and stared at the shirt folded on the table. That is my shirt, he said. Yes. He looked at her. He looked at the shirt. He did not seem to know what to do with his hands. You did not have to do that, ma'am. Della, you did not have to do that. I know, I wanted to. He picked up the shirt. He held it the way a man holds something that has surprised him into silence. The collar was small and neat and even. The buttons had been reset on tighter thread. The frayed cuffs had been turned and re-hemmed so that they would last another winter. It was not fancy work. It was honest work done the way Boston grandmothers had done it for 200 years. Thank you, he said. He said it very quietly. Friends, gather close for this one. This is old Jeb. I have to stop the story right here because if I do not stop it, you will miss what just happened. A woman mended a shirt and a man held it in his hands as if she had handed him a piece of his own heart. That is how love begins for people who have been hurt enough, not in lightning, in sewing, in coffee, in the patient small offerings of 2 hands learning each other across a pine table. Watch for it, friends. The Lord works in stitches. A week passed, then another. By the second week, Della had learned to load a Winchester rifle. Silas had insisted on it. He had taken her out behind the barn on the 7th morning and walked her through it the way a patient older brother walks a younger sister through a thing she does not want to learn but will be glad to know. This is the lever. This is the chamber. This is the safety. You count your rounds, 7 in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 8 total. You do not ever let yourself believe a rifle is empty until you have personally seen it empty. Yes, ma'am, even mine. Yes, sir. He set up 3 tin cans on a stump at 30 paces. He gave her the rifle. He stood at her shoulder. Tuck the stock tight to your shoulder. No tighter. The kick is going to surprise you the first time. The kick is the rifle telling you it did its job. Do not flinch from it. Welcome it. She fired. She missed by 2 feet. She fired again. She missed by 1 foot. She fired a 3rd time, and the middle can went over backward off the stump. Silas whistled low. Della, he said, we will make a Wyoming woman of you yet. She did not smile. She lowered the rifle carefully and worked the lever the way he had shown her. She slid another round into the chamber. She looked at the 2 remaining cans. Silas, she said quietly, will I need to know this for hunting or for something else? He was silent a moment. For something else, he said. She nodded. She raised the rifle again. The 2nd can went over. Then the 3rd. She set the safety. She handed the rifle back to him without speaking. He looked at her a long moment. I will tell my brother, he said, that you are a quick study. I will not tell him you asked me that question. He worries enough. Thank you, Silas. She walked back to the cabin alone through the snow. Behind her, Silas Mercer stood by the splitting block with the rifle in his hands and looked at the 3 fallen cans, and his mouth was set in a way that was not quite a smile and not quite a frown. He was thinking that the woman his brother had brought home from Boston had a steadier hand on a rifle at 30 paces than half the men he had ever ridden with, and that this was either a wonderful thing or a terrible thing, and he did not yet know which. The first attack came on the morning of the 27th of November. It came at dawn when the light was still gray and uncertain and the world was at its quietest. Silas was at the woodpile behind the cabin when he heard the crows. He did not call out. He simply walked fast and low back to the cabin door and slipped inside without a sound. He had his Winchester in his hand before he had taken 3 steps. 3 men, he said, South Ridge, coming down through the pines on foot. Caleb was already moving. Della had been at the stove. She set down the iron kettle without spilling a drop of coffee, and she walked to the cartridge box on the shelf, and she took out 2 boxes of 44-40 rounds without being told. Caleb saw her doing it. He did not say anything. He simply took the loaded Winchester from the wall hook and went to the south window. They came in low and quiet. 3 men, heavy coats, hired guns by the look of them, not local men. The first one raised his rifle when he was 50 yards out, and that was the last decision he made in this world. Caleb shot him through the chest from the cabin window. The man fell into the snow without a sound. The other 2 men dropped behind a fallen log and began firing back. Silas slipped out the back door of the cabin and circled south through the pines the way he had circled wolves in his younger years. Della heard his Winchester 3 minutes later, 2 shots in quick succession from a place the gunman had not been expecting fire to come from. A man cried out, then a second man cried out, then silence. Silas came back 10 minutes later, breathing hard. His face was set. "That is 2 of them done," he said. "The third one broke and ran south toward the meadow. I clipped him in the thigh, but he kept moving. He will be at South Pass City by tomorrow night. If he does not bleed out on the trail, Holloway will know we are armed and we are not afraid." Della had not realized Caleb was bleeding until he sat down at the table to reload. There was a small dark stain growing on his left sleeve at the bicep, no larger than a silver dollar. "Caleb, it is nothing. The window casing took a splinter when the first man fired. I caught a piece of it. Take off your shirt." He looked at her. She was not asking. She had her sewing kit in her hand already and a clean cotton cloth and the brown jug of whiskey. She had been holding the whiskey jug for half a minute and he had not noticed. He took off his shirt. The splinter had driven in shallow but ugly a piece of pine the length of a thumbnail buried sideways in the muscle of his upper arm. Della took the small, narrow blade Silas used for skinning hair. She held it in the flame of the lamp for a slow count of 10. She wiped it on the cotton cloth. She did not say a word to Caleb. She did not give him time to brace. She cut once clean and shallow along the line of the splinter. She pulled the splinter out with her sewing needle as a lever. It came clear in one piece. She poured whiskey over the wound. Caleb's jaw set. He did not make a sound. 5 stitches, she said. 5. Della, "I am stitching you up, Caleb Mercer. Either you sit still or I will ask your brother to hold your arm." Silas, sitting at the far end of the table, cleaning his Winchester, did not look up, but the smallest movement at the corner of his mouth told Della he was enjoying this enormously. She stitched the wound in 7 minutes, 5 small, neat knots, each one tied off the way her father had taught her to tie off the binding thread on his accounting ledgers, which was the same way her mother had taught her to tie off a hem on a Sunday dress. Caleb watched her face the whole time. He did not look at the needle. When she finished, she bandaged the arm with strips of clean cotton from her petticoat. She tied the bandage off. She looked up at his face. He was looking at her. His eyes had a quality she had not seen in them before. It was not pain. It was something else. It was the look of a man who has just understood with absolute clarity that the woman he had brought home from Boston 3 weeks ago was not the woman he had thought he was bringing home. She was something else entirely. She was something he had not dared to hope for. "You learned that in Boston," he said. "I learned it from my mother. She nursed 2 cousins through diphtheria in 1881. And she made me watch every stitch. She said a woman in this country never knew when she would need to mend a man instead of a shirt. Your mother sounds like she knew things. She did. She died when I was 8, but she taught me enough to last." Caleb reached across the table with his good hand and laid it very gently on top of hers. "I am beginning to think," he said, "that I do not deserve you." She smiled. It was the smallest smile. It did not reach her eyes because her eyes were too busy. "You are wrong about that, Caleb Mercer. I am beginning to think it is the other way around." Now, folks, listen close. This is your old narrator coming back to the campfire for a moment. 3 men had walked down a ridge to kill a family in their cabin. 2 of those men were now dead in the snow, and the third was bleeding south toward town with a story to tell. And inside the cabin, a Boston woman with a sewing needle had just stitched a piece of pine out of a mountain man's arm and made him understand for the first time in his 31 years that he had been waiting for her without knowing it. Sometimes love does not arrive on a horse. Sometimes love arrives on a 5-stitch suture in a cabin that has just been shot at. Watch for it, friends. The Lord works in needles. That night, Silas drew up the first map of the canyon defenses on a sheet of brown paper. By morning, the plan that would later be remembered as the avalanche plan was already taking shape. The trouble came in earnest on the morning of the 20th day. It was the kind of morning that begins so quietly a man does not notice the quiet until afterward. The wind had dropped, the snow had stopped, the sun had come up white and cold over the eastern ridge and lit the canyon in colors so pale they looked washed. Della had risen at 6 and made coffee. Silas had come in from his trap line at 7 with 3 hairs and a strange look on his face. Caleb, outside, now. Caleb set down his cup and went out with him. He did not put on his hat. Della watched from the kitchen window. The 2 men stood by the corral, and Silas was pointing east along the canyon rim very slowly with his whole arm. Caleb stood very still. He looked east. He looked at his brother. He looked east again. When they came back inside, both men were carrying their Winchesters. Della stood up from the table. "What is it?" Silas hung his rifle on the wall hook beside the door. He did not sit down. "Hoof prints," he said. "4 horses." up on the ridge above the South Meadow. They came in last night. They stopped maybe 200 yards from the cabin. They sat there, then they turned around and rode back the way they came. They did not light a fire. They did not break trail. They were watching. Della's hand found the edge of the table and held on. Her face did not change. She had been waiting for this for 3 weeks. Holloway's scouts, she said. Caleb looked at her. Most likely. Sent up here to count us after the third man got back to town. They will report tonight. Holloway will know exactly how we are situated. Della took a slow breath. She let it out. She walked to the cabin door and turned the heavy iron bar that locked it from the inside. She had not used that bar before. She did not know it would feel so heavy. She turned back to the two brothers. I think it is time, she said, that I told you the rest of it. Old Jeb's voice slides in here, low and serious. Folks, here is the moment when the story stops being one thing and becomes another. Up to this point, you have been watching three people learn each other, a man learning to live again, a woman learning to trust, a brother learning to share a cabin. Now the wolf has paid 2 visits. Now the past comes inside and sits down at the table. Now Cordelia Hartwell is about to open the cedar trunk that she has been guarding for 3 months, and what comes out of that trunk is going to put a noose around the neck of the most powerful man in this territory, but it is also going to put a target on the back of every soul in this cabin. Watch carefully. This is the hinge. This is where the story turns. Della went upstairs. She came back down with the cedar trunk in both arms. It was heavy. She had carried it across 2,000 miles. She set it on the pine table between the two brothers and pulled the small brass key from the chain around her neck. She opened the trunk. She lifted out 3 dresses and a Bible and a framed daguerreotype of a thin, gray man with kind eyes. She set these things carefully on a chair, then she reached down to the bottom of the trunk and pressed her fingers into the corner seam, and a false bottom of pine board lifted out. Beneath it lay the ledger. It was bound in calfskin the color of dark honey. It was perhaps 3 inches thick. The initials HH were stamped in plain letters on the spine. 1885 to 1887. She set it on the table. This was my father's, she said. His name was Hollis Hartwell. He was an accountant. He was honest. For 31 years, he kept books that always added up. He was the gentlest man I ever knew. He could not raise his voice to a horse. In 1885, he took a position with a shipping concern in Boston called Hartford and Holloway Limited. The salary was good. The work seemed quiet. He told me he liked it because the numbers always added up. She paused. Her hands were folded very carefully in front of her. She did not look at the ledger. She looked at the wall above Caleb's shoulder. In the spring of this year, the numbers stopped adding up. There were shipments that had not shipped. There were payments to men in Wyoming territory in amounts that no shipping company would ever pay. I found one of the irregularities first because I was helping with his correspondence. I brought it to him. He told me to forget it. He did not forget it. He spent 3 months tracing the money. He built this ledger. He hid it in this trunk in July. Before he hid it, he sat me down at our kitchen table one night by lamplight, and he made me memorize 3 things. The names of the men in this book, the amounts of the bribes, and the gold ring on Mayor Jubal Holloway's right hand, the size of a hazelnut, which he wore on the small finger of his right hand without fail. He said if anything ever happened to him, I would have to recognize Holloway on sight, and there would be no second chance. I memorized them. In August, he was killed in what the newspapers called a carriage accident on Tremont Street. There was no accident. They murdered him for what is in this book. She breathed in. She breathed out. The ledger contains the names, dates, and amounts paid by Mayor Jubal Holloway to 13 different men over the course of 2 years. It documents the burning of 11 homesteads across Absaroka and Fremont counties in Wyoming. It names 2 territorial judges and 1 United States senator who took bribes to look the other way. It names the men who held the torches. It names the sheriff who filed the false reports. She paused again. It names, she said quietly, the burning of a homestead in Absaroka County on the 12th of May in 1885. $500 paid to Sheriff Edmund Pierce to handle the matter. The name of the property is recorded in my father's hand. The name is Mercer. The cabin was so quiet that Della could hear the small ticking sound of the stove. Silas reached forward and laid one large hand flat on the ledger. He did not open it. He just rested his hand on the cover, the way a man rests his hand on a coffin lid. Show me, he said. She turned the pages slowly. She found the entry. She turned the ledger around and slid it across the table to him. Silas read it. His face did not change. He read it twice. He read it a third time. Then he stood up very slowly, walked to the door, opened it, walked out, and shut it behind him. A moment later, Della and Caleb heard him strike something with his fist. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, 5, then nothing. Caleb had not moved. He sat with his hands flat on the table on either side of the ledger. He was looking at the entry. His face was the color of bone. 5 years, he said. His voice was very low. We have waited 5 years. We have hunted down 3 of the men who rode that night, one by one, and we have not been able to touch the man who paid them. And you, you walked 2,700 miles in a crimson velvet dress, and you set him on this table, Della. Della, what have you done? I am sorry, she whispered. Why are you sorry? I brought them here. I brought them to your door. The men on the ridge last week, the 4 scouts last night. They are here because I am here. If I had stayed in Boston, they would not be here. They would be there, and you and Silas would not be in danger. I am so sorry, Caleb. I should not have come. He stood up. He walked around the table to her. She did not look up at him. She was looking at her hands. He took her hands in his very gently and lifted her to her feet. He bent his head down so that she had to look at him. His eyes were wet. Della Hartwell, he said, you listen to me. You did not bring them here. They were coming, whether you came or not. Holloway has wanted us dead for 5 years. He has wanted you dead for 3 months. The Lord did not put you on that train to ruin us. He put you on that train to give us at last, after 5 years of empty silence, the one thing we have never had. Evidence, names, dates, a book that can hang him. You are not the trouble, Della. You are the gun that we have been waiting for. She was crying. She did not know when she had started. He did not say anything else. He simply gathered her against his chest and held her there. She was very small against him. The top of her head fit just below his collarbone. He smelled of pine smoke and cold air and the homespun shirt she had mended. She pressed her forehead into the fabric of that shirt, and she cried quietly, the way a woman cries when she has been carrying a thing alone for too long and is finally allowed to set it down. After a long time, the cabin door opened and Silas came back in. His right hand was wrapped in a strip of cloth he had torn from his own undershirt. The cloth was bleeding through. He did not seem to notice it. He walked to the table and sat down across from the ledger and looked at it for a long moment. Then he raised his eyes to Della. I owe you an apology, Miss Hartwell, he said. For what? For thinking the first day my brother brought you home that you were a delicate Boston rose who would not last a week in this country. He put out his uninjured hand across the table, palm up. She put hers in it. He closed his fingers gently around hers. You are no rose, ma'am. You are a north wind, and I am proud, very proud to call you a sister. Old Jeb's voice comes in here, gentle as a hymn at dusk. Folks, I have told a lot of stories around a lot of stoves. I have never told a better moment than that one. 2 grown men, one a widower, 5 years over, one a wounded miner, 3 years over, both of them sitting in a cabin in the high country with a Boston woman they did not know 3 weeks ago, and the 3 of them holding hands across a pine table over a book that was going to change every life in this story. I am going to ask you something. Have you ever sat with people you only just met and felt in your bones that the Lord had put you with your real family for the first time? If you have, you know what I'm talking about. If you have not, listen close, because these 3 were about to find it out together. That night, Silas did not sleep. Della heard him moving around downstairs at midnight. She heard him moving still at 2 a.m. At 3, she rose, wrapped herself in the cloak Caleb had made her, and went down quietly. He was sitting at the pine table with the ledger open in front of him and a lamp burning low. He had been reading. He had been reading for hours. His face in the lamplight looked older than his 31 years. Silas, he looked up. You should be sleeping, he said. So should you. I cannot. Every page is a name I knew. Every name is a family. She sat down across from him. There was a long silence. Then Silas said quietly, I am going to go down to South Pass City tonight. I am going to find Edmund Pierce in his bed. I am going to put my Bowie knife through his throat. I am going to do it slow. The cabin door opened behind them. Caleb stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves. He had not slept either. He must have heard the talking. He must have known what his brother would say. He walked to the table and pulled out the 3rd chair and sat down between them. No, Caleb said. Silas did not look up. No, Caleb said. Again, you are not riding tonight, Silas. You are not killing Edmund Pierce in his bed. Look at me, brother. Silas raised his eyes. If you kill Pierce, Caleb, said Holloway, wins. Hear me, he wins, because the next morning the territorial papers will say that the Mercer boys came down out of the mountains and murdered a sheriff in his bed. The marshal in Cheyenne will issue warrants on us by sundown. The ledger will be called a forgery written by a vengeful Boston spinster and 2 outlaw brothers to justify the killing. Della will go to prison. We will hang. Holloway will buy a new sheriff with a new gold ring on his hand, and the names in this book will go right on being burned out one by one. 5 more years, 10 more years, forever. He paused. We do this the right way, Silas. We do it with the law. We do it through Cheyenne. We get this ledger to a United States Marshal. We let the law put the rope around Holloway's neck. Not us. The law. Because the law is the only thing on God's earth that can take a man like Holloway down and make it stick. Silas's jaw worked. You ask a lot, he said. You ask me to sit in this cabin and chink logs while the man who burned our mother and father and Maribel sleeps in a feather bed. I ask. Caleb said that you remember what we promised her. Silas closed his eyes. Maribel had been 7 years old when she died. She had been the youngest. She had been the surprise child born late to a tired mother. She had followed her older twin brothers everywhere on her short legs. She had called them both K because she could not, at 3 years old, manage 2 different names for 2 boys who looked exactly alike. The brothers had let her. They had answered to K together. They had carried her on their shoulders. They had taught her to ride a pony when she was 5. In the spring of 1885, she had been 7, and on the night of the 12th of May, she had been in her bed when the men with the torches came. The brothers had been at a cattle auction in Lander. They had ridden home to find the homestead a black smoking ruin and 3 small graves their neighbors had been kind enough to dig. They had buried Maribel under her favorite cottonwood tree by the creek. Silas had carved her name on a wooden board with his Bowie knife. Then he had sat down beside that grave, and he had wept, and Caleb had wept with him. And at some point in the long, terrible night, Silas had said out loud to his sister and to God and to the empty Wyoming sky that he would not rest until the man who paid for the torches was in the ground. He had said it. Caleb had said it. But before either of them rose from that grave at sunrise, Caleb had said one other thing. He had said it quietly. He had said it so that Silas would never forget. We do it right, brother. We do it the way she would have wanted, not as outlaws, as men, because she was a good child, and good children grow up to want their brothers to be good men. We do it right, or we do not do it at all. Silas had agreed. He had been agreeing for 2.5 years now. In the lamplight of the cabin at 3 a.m, Silas opened his eyes again. He looked at his brother. He looked at Della. He looked at the ledger. All right, he said. Brother. All right, Caleb, we do it the right way. We do it through Cheyenne. We do it with the law. But I am telling you now, if the law fails us, if one judge takes one bribe and Holloway walks out of a courtroom a free man, then I am riding down that mountain and I am finishing this myself. I am telling you so that you can tell me later that I warned you fair. Caleb nodded slowly. Fair warned, brother. Della had been silent through all of this. Now she spoke. Beatrice Whitmore, she said. Both men looked at her. The woman at South Pass City, the boarding house. She gave me a name. She told me to send a telegram signed Mary Jane if I needed help. The name she gave me was a United States Marshal in Cheyenne. His name is Cyrus Dawson. She did not say more than that, but she said it with the certainty of a woman who knew him personally. Caleb sat back in his chair. Cyrus Dawson. I know that name. Federal Marshal, old school. There are stories about him. He looked at his brother. We send a letter, not a telegram, Caleb said. Telegrams go through clerks. Clerks talk. We write a letter. We tell him what we have. We ask him to come up the mountain in the spring with men. Until he comes, we hold this ledger here in this cabin, and we hold this cabin against anything Holloway can send. How do we get the letter to him without it going through South Pass City, Silas said. Della almost smiled. She pulled the folded square of paper out of her sleeve. I have his address, she said. Friends, listen close here. You have just watched 3 people sit down in the dark of a cabin and turn a tragedy into a plan. Watch a thing like that carefully if the Lord ever gives you the chance to see it in your own life. It is rare. It is precious. It is what survival looks like before it becomes triumph. They did not yet know how much winter was coming. They did not yet know that Mayor Jubal Holloway had already counted his 40 riders and bought his 80 rifles. They did not yet know that the letter to Marshal Dawson would have to travel 600 miles in the pocket of a peddler named Otis Tibbs, who was an honest man and a slow horse. They did not yet know that Maribel Mercer's name was about to be answered. They only knew that they were 3. They only knew that they were not alone. Sometimes, friends, that is enough to begin. The letter was finished by dawn. Silas saddled the fastest horse in the barn, a chestnut gelding named Hardtack, and rode it down to a switchback 4 miles below the cabin where the peddler Otis Tibbs was due to come through with his wagon on the way to Lander. Silas knew Tibbs. They had bought salt and coffee and lamp oil from him for 3 years. Tibbs was a Methodist and a widower and a man who did not love Mayor Jubal Holloway. He took the letter into his inner vest pocket without asking what was in it. He said only this: I will hand it to Marshal Dawson myself, son. I will not give it to a clerk, and I will not give it to a deputy. I will put it in his hand, or I will bring it back to you. Silas rode home through the morning light with snow falling on his hat and the first real feeling of motion in his chest in 5 years. The thing they had been waiting for was no longer a wish. It was a horse and a peddler and a folded piece of paper riding south. Back at the cabin, Caleb stood on the porch and watched his brother return up the trail. Della came out beside him with a tin cup of coffee for each of them. She did not speak. Caleb took the coffee. He drank it. After a while, without looking down, he set his free hand on the rail beside hers so that the edge of his little finger touched the edge of her hand. She did not move. He did not move. They stood on the porch and watched the snow fall on the canyon and watched Silas come up the long white slope toward home. And somewhere far below them in the world, a peddler named Otis Tibbs was carrying a piece of paper that would in time hang a man with a gold ring on his finger. The mountain had decided. The mountain don't keep what it doesn't want, but what it keeps forever. And it had decided that snowy morning to keep all three of them. The first snow of December came in slow and patient, and it stayed. By the morning of the 3rd of December, Dead Man's Drop was buried to the second window of the cabin on the north wall. The drifts against the barn rose higher than a tall man's shoulder. The horses had been moved into the lean to forage so they could share the warmth of the dying coals overnight. Silas had broken trail to the woodshed twice already with a wide-handled snow shovel, and the trail had filled in behind him both times within an hour. The letter to Marshal Cyrus Dawson had been gone for 9 days. Otis Tibbs and his slow horse were somewhere on the long road south. They could expect no answer until the new year at the earliest, perhaps not until February if the storms held. Until then, the three of them had only each other and the cabin. Della found in those December days that she was not afraid. She had expected to be afraid. She had expected the long nights and the howling wind and the constant awareness of men on the ridge to grind her down to thin nerves. Instead, something in her was settling. The fear that had lived in her chest since the day her father died had grown quieter. It had not gone. It had merely lain down beside the fire and closed its eyes. She thought sometimes that this was what a home felt like. She had not been certain before because she had not been certain she remembered. On the morning of the 5th of December, Caleb came down at dawn with his bare hide coat over his arm and a coil of rope across his shoulder. "I am going up the ridge," he said. "Silas tracked deer sign yesterday at the saddle. We need the meat before the deep cold sets in. I will be back by dusk." Della was at the stove pouring coffee. She paused with the pot in her hand. "Up the ridge alone," she said. "Silas's leg is stiff this week. 2 days of breaking trail to the woodshed has set it back. He will stay here with you. I will be back by dusk." She set the coffee pot down on the stove. She turned to him. He was already buttoning his coat. His face was calm. He had been hunting alone in these mountains for 15 years. There was no reason to be afraid. There was no reason to be afraid. She told herself that very clearly. Then she crossed the small kitchen to him and reached up and adjusted the wool muffler around his neck. She tucked it down inside the collar of his coat the way she had seen her mother do for her father 1,000 times in Boston winters. She did it without thinking. He went very still while she did it. His hands stopped on the buttons of his coat. He looked down at her face. She was looking at his muffler. "There," she said. "Now you will not lose your throat to the cold. Della." She finally looked up. He bent his head and kissed her. It was not a long kiss. It was a quiet one. His mouth was warm and tasted faintly of coffee, and his hand came up and cupped the side of her face with a gentleness that should not have been possible from a hand that large. And in that moment, in the warmth of his hand and the cold of the snow falling beyond the doorway, she felt the mountain decide. The mountain had been listening all autumn. The mountain had been waiting. The mountain had chosen in that kiss that it was going to keep her. He drew back. "I will be home by dusk," he said. "Be home by dusk," she answered. He left. She watched him go from the cabin window. He moved up the snowfield in long, easy strides, his Winchester slung across his back, the rope coiled over his shoulder, his bare hide coat dark against the white slope. He grew smaller. He disappeared into the pines at the saddle. Della pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window and stood there a long time after he was gone. Now you listen, friends. This is your old narrator coming in. I have told this story for 40 years, and I have never gotten past this scene without stopping. A man going up a mountain with his throat covered against the cold by a woman who had only known him 5 weeks, and he stopped on his way out the door to set the thing right between them before he went. That is how mountain people kiss when they mean it. Not on porches at sunset, at the front door with a rifle on the shoulder in case the mountain takes them and the kiss has to be enough. Watch for it in your own life. The Lord gives those moments rarely. They are worth more than weddings. He came home at dusk with a mule deer doe across his shoulders. He came home alive. He came home with his cheeks burned red from the cold and his beard frosted white and his eyes lit with the steady, quiet light of a man who has done a thing he set out to do. Della had been at the window for the last hour. She did not run to meet him. She only watched him come down the slope. That night, they ate venison liver pan fried in bacon grease, and Silas put down his fork halfway through the meal and looked at his brother and his sister-in-law to be across the pine table, and said with the smallest dry smile that he wondered if perhaps a small chapel might be considered. There was no preacher within 4 days' ride, but there was a Bible on the top shelf, and there were 3 souls in this cabin, and the Lord had been known to officiate his own weddings when there was no other choice. Della looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at her. "I will marry you, Della Hartwell," Caleb said, "if you will have me." "I will have you," she said. Silas stood up from the table. He walked to the top shelf. He took down the Bible. He laid it on the pine table between them. "Then there is no reason to wait," he said. "Tomorrow, then. Tomorrow at sundown. I will stand witness. The Lord will stand officiant. The mountain will stand church." They were married on the 6th of December, 1887. Della wore the crimson velvet traveling dress. She had no other dress fine enough, and besides, it had carried her 2,000 miles to this cabin. It had earned the right to stand with her at this moment. She brushed out her honey-colored hair until it shone in the firelight and pinned a small sprig of mountain juniper into the loose Victorian twist. There was no veil, there were no flowers, there was no bell. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt, which Della herself had washed and pressed against the warm side of the stove that morning. He had shaved. His hair was combed back wet. He stood by the fireplace with his hands folded in front of him and his face open in a way Della had not seen before, as though every wall he had carried for 5 years had been set down at the door. Silas read from the book of Ruth. "Whither thou goest, I will go. Thy people shall be my people." He read it slowly. He read it the way a man reads who is reading for his sister Maribel as much as for the 2 souls in front of him. When he finished, he closed the Bible and laid his hand on top of it. "Caleb Mercer," he said, "do you take this woman, Cordelia Hartwell, to be your wife, to keep her in storm and in still, to stand between her and harm as long as God grants you breath, to love her even in the silent places where love does not have words?" "I do," Caleb said. "Cordelia Hartwell, do you take this man, Caleb Mercer, to be your husband, to stand by him when his back is to the wall, to stand by him when his back is to the world, to love him through grief and through joy and through whatever the high country sends?" "I do," Della said. "By the authority of these mountains," Silas said quietly, "and by the grace of the Lord above us, I name you husband and wife. The mountain don't keep what it doesn't want, but what it keeps forever. The mountain has kept you both, brother, sister. Welcome home." Caleb bent. Della rose up on her toes. They kissed beside the fireplace while Silas put one large hand on each of their shoulders and bowed his head over them like a brother and a witness and a benediction all at once. That night, when supper was done and the dishes were washed, and Silas had quietly taken his blanket and his pillow and made up a bed for himself by the front room stove, leaving the upstairs to the new couple, Della went up the narrow staircase with Caleb's hand wrapped around hers. The cabin door was barred, the Winchester was loaded by the door, the wind was howling clean and cold across the high country of Wyoming, the bedroom door closed softly behind them. When morning came, the cabin was very quiet, and the new day had a different color than the old days. That was all that needed to be said. Some things belong only to the 2 who shared them. The Lord arranges. The Lord does not require an audience. Old Jeb's voice slips in here, warm as a hand on a back. Friends, I have been telling this story for 40 years, and I have always paused right there. Not because there is anything wrong with what happens after a wedding. There is not. The Lord made marriage. The Lord blessed marriage. But because the part that matters about that night is not the part you can see, the part that matters is what it meant. It meant that a man who had buried his first wife in 1882 had decided after 5 years of empty silence to live again. It meant that a woman who had buried her father in August had decided that she was no longer running. It meant that 2 souls had found each other on a mountain in the middle of a winter that was going to try to kill them all. Hold that in your mind. Hold it gently. We are going to need it before the story is finished. The new year came in cold. By the 3rd of January, the snowpack on the canyon walls above Dead Man's Drop stood at 14 feet on the north slopes. Silas walked the perimeter every dawn with his Winchester and his eyes on the ridge. The scouts had not come back since the night before they revealed the ledger. That worried Silas more than if they had come back twice. "They are waiting," he told Caleb over coffee on the morning of the 5th. "They are waiting for the snow to get so deep that no marshal in Cheyenne can ride. They are waiting until they own the weather." When Caleb said, "I would come the 2nd or 3rd week of January if I were Holloway, maybe a touch later, late enough that the marshal cannot reach us, soon enough that we cannot break south to him." Caleb nodded slowly. "Then we have a week, maybe 2. We have a week, maybe 2. That night after supper, Silas laid out his plan on the pine table with 3 pieces of charred kindling and a sheet of brown paper. He drew the cabin, he drew the canyon walls, he drew the barn and the corral and the woodshed. Then he drew in small, careful X marks, 4 places on the canyon rim above the cabin. Old mine dynamite, he said. 18 sticks. I brought them out of Leadville 3 years ago in a flour sack. I had a notion they might come in useful someday. I did not yet have a notion for what. Now I have a notion. He looked at his brother. We rig 4 charges, 1 on each weak point in the north snowpack. We run fuse line down through the trees to a single detonator behind the cabin. When the riders come into the canyon, we wait until they are deep in all of them, well past the meadow line. Then we blow the charges. The snowpack does the rest. The mountain does the rest. Caleb stared at the drawing a long time. You want to bring down the north slope on 40 men, he said. I want to bring the mountain down on 40 men, Silas said. Yes, brother, I do. Della had been listening from the stove. She set down the kettle. Silas, she said. He looked at her. How sure are you, she said, that you can place the charges where they need to be? How sure are you that the fuse line will hold in this cold? How sure are you that the detonator will fire on the first crank? Silas considered her question with the seriousness it deserved. The charge is 80%. I worked dynamite for 6 years. I know what I am doing. The fuse line, 60%. The cold makes it brittle. We will need to wrap it in oiled cloth and bury it under the snow as we lay it. The detonator, 90%. It is a good box, Leadville made. Della nodded. And if any of the 3 fails on the night they come, she said, then we have rifles, Silas said. And we have the cabin walls, and we have the Lord. In that order. She nodded again. I will help you lay the fuse line, she said. Caleb looked at her sharply. Della, I will help you lay the fuse line, she said again calmly. I am the smallest of the 3 of us. I can move along the bottom of a snow trench more easily than either of you. I have steady hands. I helped my father with his accounts for years. I understand counting and measuring. Silas, tell me what to do. I will do it. Silas looked at his brother. He looked back at Della. He set down the charred kindling. You will do, Della Mercer, he said quietly. You will do just fine. Old Jeb's voice settles over this like the snow over a track. Folks, you have just heard a new name, Della Mercer. She had been Della Hartwell for 22 years. She had been a Mercer for less than a month, but Silas Mercer had been calling her Miss Hartwell, and now he was calling her Mrs. Mercer, and the change of name was not a courtesy. It was a recognition. She had earned it. She had earned it the way the people of these mountains earned anything, by saying, I will. Watch her now. The Boston girl is gone. There is a Mercer in her place. They worked for 6 days. They worked from before sunrise until well after dark. Silas placed the charges on the 4 weakest points of the north snowpack, prying them into pockets of ice under overhangs and packing them with snow so that they would not be visible from the canyon floor. Caleb and Della ran the fuse line. They wrapped each section in strips of oiled flour sack. They buried it in shallow trenches along the contour of the slope, marking the line every 50 paces with a single small twig of red dogwood stuck upright in the snow, the kind of marker that meant nothing to a stranger and everything to the 3 of them. On the 6th day in the early afternoon, with the wind low and the sky clear, Silas connected the 4 fuse lines to a single brass detonator box inside a hollow stump 20 paces behind the cabin. He covered the stump with a piece of canvas. He covered the canvas with snow. The detonator was invisible from any angle and waterproof from any storm. Silas placed his hand flat on the canvas, closed his eyes, and said a short prayer that Della did not catch the words of. Then he stood and walked back to the cabin. It is set, he said. That night they sat at the pine table over supper, the 3 of them, and Caleb laid his hand over Della's on the tabletop and looked at his brother. We have done what we can do, he said. The Lord does the rest, Silas said. The Lord does the rest, Della agreed. Old Jeb's voice comes in here low and almost reverent. Folks, there is a quiet that comes at the end of preparation, a quiet that you only know if you have ever in your life prepared with your own hands for trouble you cannot avoid. The crops are in, the barn is mended, the rifle is loaded, the doors are barred, there is nothing left to do but wait. That quiet is one of the most sacred things in this world. It is the quiet of 3 souls who have laid down all they can lay down, and now they are simply alive together in a warm room, listening to the wind. Cherish such moments if the Lord ever gives them to you. They never last as long as you wish. The riders came on the 8th of January. They came before dawn. Silas knew before they crossed the meadow line because the crows in the cottonwoods on the south rim lifted all at once half a mile down canyon the way crows lift only for men. He was on the porch with his Winchester in his hands and his bear coat on his shoulders within 60 seconds of the lift of the crows. He went back inside. They are coming. How many? Caleb said. I cannot count yet. More than 4. Many more. Caleb stood. He walked to Della. He took her face in both his hands and looked into her eyes for one long moment. You have the copies of the ledger hidden. I have 3 copies. One with Beatrice, one under the porch step, one inside the stove brick. You know what to do if the cabin falls. I know. He kissed her once, hard and quick on the forehead. He turned to his brother. We hold until they are past the meadow line. We hold. The brothers took their positions. Silas climbed to the small loft above the bedroom where Caleb had cut a narrow rifle slit in the south wall the previous summer. Caleb stationed himself at the main window of the front room. Della sat below him at his feet with the cartridge box open in her lap. She had been practicing. She could reload a Winchester now in 12 seconds. She had counted. She was the loader. They came up the canyon in a long winding column. 40 riders, 40 horses. They moved at a slow trot through the deep snow because the snow would not let them move faster. Mayor Jubal Holloway rode at the front on a white gelding wearing a beaver coat trimmed in fox. Sheriff Edmund Pierce rode at his right shoulder. The rest of them were paid guns from Cheyenne and Denver and points further. They were not local men. Local men knew the canyon. These men did not. They passed the cottonwoods at the meadow line. Silas's voice came down through the loft hatch, low and steady. Now, brother, Caleb fired the first shot. He did not aim it at Holloway. He aimed it at the standard bearer, a young rider on a paint horse who carried a small lance with a red rag tied to it as a banner. The rag fell into the snow. The men in the column flinched. Holloway's face went very still. Then everything began at once. Caleb fired 6 rounds in 12 seconds. Della reloaded. She was as good as her word. He fired 6 more. In the loft above, Silas was firing, methodically picking off riders on the flanks of the column where they had nowhere to hide from his angle. 3 men went down in the first minute, then 5, then 7. Holloway shouted orders. The column broke. Riders fanned out across the snow. Some of them charged the cabin. Some of them tried to climb the south slope to outflank the rifle in the loft. Silas crawled down from the loft and took the detonator box from its hollow stump. He brought it inside. He set it on the pine table. He uncoiled 40 feet of fuse line through the cabin door, paying it out carefully through a small gap he had cut in the door frame for this purpose. He looked at Caleb. Now, brother. Now. Silas turned the brass crank. The first charge fired. A long, flat thunder rolled across the canyon. High on the north slope, an overhang of ice broke loose with a sound like a great door slamming. A wave of snow the size of a barn began to slide. The second charge fired 3 seconds later. The third. The fourth did not fire. Silas turned the crank a second time. Nothing. He turned it a third time. Nothing. The line was cut. Della saw his face go gray. Up on the north slope, the first 3 avalanches had brought down perhaps 3/4 of the snowpack. The riders in the front and middle of the column were being swallowed. Holloway's white horse went under, throwing its rider clear, and Holloway scrambled across the snow, shouting and unhurt. Pierce had turned his horse early and was already galloping back toward the canyon mouth. But the fourth charge had been placed at the head of the canyon at the spot that would bring down the cliff face above Pierce's escape route. With that charge dead, Pierce was going to ride free. Caleb saw it the same instant Silas did. He set down his Winchester. He picked up the long, heavy Sharps buffalo rifle from the rack above the fireplace. He walked to the door, Caleb Della said. He turned. He looked at her. He was very calm. I have to make the shot from outside, Della. The angle from the window will not give me line on the charge. I will be quick, reload my Winchester, and bring it to the door, cover me from the doorway. He stepped out into the snow. He walked 20 paces from the cabin. He went to one knee. He set the long octagonal barrel of the Sharps across the top of the splitting block. Della ran to the doorway with the Winchester. She saw in one terrible glance 3 things at the same time. She saw Caleb on his knee in the open snow, exposed, aiming up at the cliff. She saw Pierce galloping out of the canyon mouth, almost free. And she saw 6 riders on the south flank, men who had survived the first avalanches, riding hard toward the cabin from the east, no more than 300 yards out, and one of them was raising his rifle. She raised the Winchester. She fired again. She missed the first time. The second man twisted in his saddle but did not fall. The man with the raised rifle was aiming at Caleb. He fired. The shot struck Caleb in the upper left arm in almost the same spot where the splinter had been 6 weeks earlier. He grunted and went sideways into the snow. The sharps fell out of his hands. Caleb Della screamed. Folks, lean in. This is the moment. Old Jeb is going to tell you straight. This is the moment that the entire story has been waiting for. A man on his knee in the snow with a buffalo rifle, a bullet in his arm, a buffalo gun in the snow, a sheriff galloping free at the canyon mouth, 40 bodies sinking in the avalanche, and a young woman from Boston in a doorway with a Winchester. Now you watch what she does. Now you watch what a Mercer woman is. Della did not think. She did not have time to think. Some part of her, the part her father had trained, the part Silas had drilled, the part the mountain had made, simply moved. She ran out into the snow. She did not feel the cold. She did not feel the rifle slap of the men firing from the east. She reached Caleb in 7 strides. She knelt beside him. She saw the blood on his sleeve dark against the bare hide. She saw his eyes still open. Up, she said, get up, behind the splitting block. He moved. She dragged him by his good arm. He half crawled, half rolled behind the heavy pine-splitting block. She pushed him flat against it. She picked up the sharps from the snow where it had fallen. She had never fired a sharps. The sharps weighed 15 pounds. The sharps was a long-range buffalo gun made for grown men. The sharps would kick her shoulder into purple bruises. She did not care. She knelt in the snow where Caleb had been kneeling. She laid the long octagonal barrel across the top of the splitting block. She put her left elbow on her left knee and her right elbow tight to her ribs, the way her father had shown her when he had taught her to shoot pheasants on Cape Cod when she was 13 years old. She did not aim at Pierce. She had no shot on Pierce. She aimed at the 4th dynamite charge. 200 yards up the cliff, a small, dark bundle in a pocket of ice no larger than a loaf of bread. She breathed in. She held it. She thought of her father. She squeezed the trigger. The sharps roared. The stock slammed her shoulder so hard she saw stars. The bullet flew. For 1 full second, there was nothing. For 2 full seconds, then the 4th charge exploded. The cliff face above the canyon mouth came apart. 20,000 tons of snow and ice and shattered rock peeled off the wall and fell in a long white thunder that shook the cabin and the barn and the very mountain itself. Sheriff Edmund Pierce was at the canyon mouth when it fell. The avalanche caught the hindquarters of his horse and tumbled both rider and animal sideways into a deep drift at the edge of the slide. The horse died on the spot. Pierce did not. The snow pinned him to the waist, and there he stayed trapped and conscious, his rifle 6 feet beyond his reach, while the canyon went silent around him. He would still be there at dusk when the Mercer brothers came down to find him. He would still be there when they tied his hands. He would learn in those long hours of waiting in the snow what it felt like to be a man no horse could save. But that part comes later. For now, the canyon went silent. The 6 riders on the east flank of the cabin turned their horses to run and were caught against the southern wall of the canyon by the spreading edge of the slide, and they too were buried. Mayor Jubal Holloway had been clawing across the snow on hands and knees 50 yards from the cabin when the second wave of the avalanche reached him. He looked up once. He saw very faintly through the rushing white a small figure kneeling behind a splitting block with a long buffalo rifle in her hands. He had time to understand who she was. He had time to understand who her father had been. Then the snow took him. The canyon went silent. Della knelt in the snow with the sharps still pressed to her shoulder. She could not move. She could not lower the rifle. Her ears were ringing. Her shoulder was on fire. Beside her in the snow, Caleb was looking up at her with his good hand pressed to his bleeding arm and an expression on his face that she had never seen on any human face before. Della, he whispered. Della, Della. She lowered the rifle. Silas came out of this cabin at a run, dragging his bad leg through the snow, his Winchester held high in one hand. He stopped beside the splitting block. He looked at the canyon. He looked at his brother. He looked at his sister-in-law kneeling in the snow with the smoking sharps. He sat down hard on his knees in the snow beside them. Lord above, he said, Lord above, Lord above, Lord above. Old Jeb's voice falls in here, soft and full and slow. Folks, that was it. That was the multi-layer role reversal that this whole story has been pointing at since the first morning Caleb Mercer's hand shook around a tin cup of coffee. A Boston woman in a wool dress in the snow with a buffalo rifle taller than her own arm had reached up 200 yards and pulled down a cliff face on the man who killed her father. The mountain had not done it. The brothers had not done it. The Lord had done it through her, through a small woman with steady hands and a memory of her father teaching her to breathe before she pulled, through a girl that a mayor with a gold ring had laughed at 2 months ago in a snowy street. The mountain had decided what it wanted to keep. The mountain had kept her, and what the mountain keeps, friends, what the mountain keeps. The cabin was buried within the hour. The aftershock of the avalanche, the long settling slide of the secondary snowpack, came down across Dead Man's Drop in a slow, ponderous wave. It piled against the south wall of the cabin and rose past the second-story window. It piled against the door. It piled against the roof until the roof beams groaned and held. It piled until the cabin was a small, dark cave inside a mountain of white. Silas had pulled Caleb and Della inside in the last seconds before the wave hit. Pierce was 300 yards away across the canyon floor where the snow had pinned him to the waist. Silas could not reach him in time. Pierce would have to wait there in the snow until the brothers could dig out and come for him. Silas had thrown his body across both his brother and his sister-in-law as the snow came against the door. The door had held, the cabin had held, the three of them were alive. Della worked on Caleb's arm by the light of a single lantern. The bullet had gone clean through the muscle of the upper arm without striking the bone in almost the same place she had stitched him 6 weeks earlier. She washed the wound with whiskey from the brown jug Silas kept under the stove. She closed it with 3 small stitches of black silk thread. Her hands shook through the first stitch. They did not shake through the second or the third. She had used up her shaking out in the snow. Caleb watched her face the whole time. He did not look at the needle. When she finished, she sat back on her heels. She set down the needle. She looked at her husband of 1 month, and she looked at his brother sitting against the wall with his bad legs stretched out and his head bowed, and she looked at the small, dark cabin around them, half buried in snow. "I am hungry," she said. It was such an ordinary thing to say that Silas began to laugh. He laughed for a long time. He laughed until tears came down his face. He laughed until Caleb began to laugh, holding his bandaged arm, and then Della began to laugh, and the 3 of them sat in the lantern light at the foot of the bed and laughed the way only people who have looked death in the face and walked away from it can laugh. For 3 days they lived in the buried cabin. The air came down through the chimney as long as Silas kept a thin fire burning on the iron stove, low and slow fed, with only the smallest pieces of split pine. They had food enough. A side of cured bacon, half a wheel of cheese Silas had bartered for at the last Lander auction, a sack of cornmeal, 3 jars of apple preserves Della had put up in November, a barrel of salt pork, 2 bushels of potatoes in the root cellar that opened off the back wall of the front room, water from the rain barrel that fed in through a pipe from the corner of the roof and ran into the stone sink. They were not going to starve. They were not going to freeze. They were going to dig out. On the second morning, Silas climbed up onto the iron stove and reached his arm up inside the chimney as far as he could. The chimney went up perhaps 8 feet inside the cabin and then opened into the snowpack above. Silas worked at the snow with the long iron poker, breaking it loose and letting it fall down into a tin bucket Della held below. By the end of the second day, he had opened a small shaft up through the snow, narrow as a barrel, and Della could see a small bright disk of blue sky at the top of it. On the third morning, Caleb, even with his stitched arm, insisted on doing the climbing. Silas held the bottom of the rope. Della held the lantern. Caleb went up the chimney and out the top of the snow shaft and stood for the first time in 3 days in the cold, clean air of the canyon. He came back down with snow on his hat and his eyes lit with a particular fire. "The canyon," he said. "You will not believe what the canyon looks like." "What?" "It is flat." The avalanche filled it. From the cabin door to the canyon mouth, half a mile of canyon floor, all of it under 10 to 30 feet of compacted snow. You cannot see the meadow. You cannot see the creek. You cannot even see the cottonwoods. The world has been wiped clean. He paused. "Pierce," he said, "did you see him?" "I saw him. He is still pinned where the snow caught him. He is alive. He is conscious. He has not moved in 3 days. I could see him watching me from across the canyon. He is waiting to see who comes for him first, us or the wolves or the cold." Silas reached for his hat and his bear coat. "Then we go get him," Silas said. Caleb nodded. "We go get him." They went together in the early afternoon, the 2 brothers, with 1 rope and 1 Winchester. They walked across the new flat surface of the canyon floor as if it were a frozen lake. They reached Pierce in 20 minutes. He was alive. He was very nearly frozen. His lips were blue. His eyes were open. He had been pinned in that snow for 3 full days, watching the cabin from across the canyon, knowing every minute that no one was coming for him until someone decided to come. He looked up at the 2 Mercer brothers standing over him. He did not beg. That was the only thing Della would later say in his favor. He did not beg. The brothers dug him out with two short shovels. They got the snow off his chest and off his arms and finally off his legs. They lifted him onto a sled they had brought made of two pine planks and a strip of canvas. They tied his wrists in front of him with a strip of harness leather. They dragged the sled back to the cabin across the new flat canyon floor. Inside the cabin, Della had a fire going hot. She had pots of melted snow simmering on the stove. She had wool blankets airing in the heat. She had stripped Pierce's frozen coat off him before they had laid him down on the floor by the stove. And she went to work on him with the calm, clinical attention of a woman who had been raised by a mother who had nursed cousins through diphtheria in 1881. She did not speak to him. She did not look at his face except to check the color of his lips. She rubbed his frozen hands with snow first to draw the freeze out, then with wool, then with warm water. She did the same with his feet. She got hot coffee into him, a spoonful at a time. She wrapped him in blankets. She watched him slowly come back, slowly, the blue draining out of his lips, the shaking starting in his hands and traveling up his arms, the awful pain of feeling returning to feet that had been on the edge of being lost. She saved Sheriff Edmund Pierce's life that afternoon. The man who had taken $500 to burn Maribel Mercer in her bed. She did it because she was Della Mercer, and Della Mercer was not the kind of woman who let a man die on her floor, even a man who deserved to die. She would let the law decide what he deserved. She would not decide. When Pierce could speak, his first words to her were these: "Why are you doing this?" She did not look up from her work, because she said, "My husband told me on the second day of our marriage that the law is the only thing on God's earth that can take a man like you down and make it stick. I am keeping you alive so that the law can have you. Do not mistake it for kindness. There is no kindness in this room for you, Sheriff Pierce. There is only the law, and the law is colder than the snow that almost killed you." Pierce closed his eyes. He did not speak again that day. For 5 days, they waited inside the cabin with Pierce tied to the second chair by the stove. They fed him. They watered him. They let him sleep. They did not torture him. They did not interrogate him. They did not speak to him at all except to give orders. Silas slept with his Bowie knife on the table where Pierce could see it. Pierce did not need to be told what the knife meant. On the 6th day after the avalanche, they dug out from the chimney shaft enough to walk 3 abreast through the canyon. The cold had broken slightly. The sun was visible. The snow underfoot was firm and easy to walk on the way snow becomes when it has settled hard for a week. They put Pierce on a horse with his hands tied to the saddle horn. They put Della on Hazel. Caleb and Silas walked. They started the long walk down to South Pass City with the ledger inside Della's saddlebag wrapped in oilcloth and a sheriff on a lead rope and the smell of pine smoke from the buried cabin growing fainter behind them as they descended out of the canyon for the first time in 2 months. They reached South Pass City 4 days later. The town saw them coming from a mile out. There was no way to miss them. 3 figures and 4 horses on the empty road, moving slow because Caleb's arm still hurt and Silas's leg still hurt, and Pierce was barely able to sit upright in the saddle. Word ran ahead of them like fire on dry grass. By the time they came into the main street of South Pass City, every door of every building had a face in it. They had not yet reached the saloon when 20 horsemen came riding up from the south end of the street in tight formation. They were not Holloway's men. They wore long blue coats, and they wore silver stars on their chests, and they rode at the head of a man perhaps 60 years old, with iron gray hair under a wide black hat and a face like a tired patient hawk. Marshal Cyrus Dawson swung down from his horse 10 feet in front of Caleb Mercer. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his voice was low and dry and old, "I have been riding for 11 days from Cheyenne with a packet of papers signed by the federal judge there and 20 United States Marshals at my back. I was hoping to find you alive. I was hoping to find the lady alive. I had heard things about your situation that did not give me much hope. I am pleased, Mr. Mercer, to be wrong," Marshal Caleb said. "I am told Dawson said that you have a ledger." "We have a ledger, Marshal." "I am told that you have a sheriff. We have a sheriff marshal. He is the third man back." "I am told," the marshal said, glancing past Caleb to where Della sat on Hazel with the cedar trunk strapped behind her saddle and the oilcloth wrapped ledger under her cloak, "that I have your mother-in-law to thank for the letter that brought me here. The Whitmore woman. Is that correct?" Della spoke for the first time. "She is not my mother-in-law, Marshal. She is my friend." "Friend, then. I owe her a debt, ma'am, and I owe Hollis Hartwell a debt that I have been waiting 29 years to repay." He sat next to me in a Boston schoolroom in 1858. He was the gentlest man I ever knew. When I heard he had been killed in a carriage accident this past August, I knew it was not a carriage accident. When I received your letter, I knew what I had been waiting 29 years for. So I rode through 11 days of bad weather with 20 marshals because I owed Hollis Hartwell that, and I owe you that, Mrs. Mercer. Della could not speak. Beatrice Whitmore came out of the boarding house and stood in the snow with her hands folded in front of her and her face composed, but her eyes very bright. Della saw her. Beatrice nodded once. Della nodded back. "What happens now?" Marshal Caleb said. Now, Dawson said we go into the saloon. We sit at a table by the stove. You give me the ledger. I read every page. Then we go up the street to the bank where Mayor Jubal Holloway kept his office. We arrest his clerk and his books. Then we ride west to his ranch. We arrest his foreman and his men. Then we send telegrams to Cheyenne for the territorial judges named in the ledger. Then we send telegrams to Washington for the senator. Then we hold a trial here in this town, in this saloon, if we have to, with 20 United States Marshals as the audience to make sure no judge takes a bribe. That is what happens now, Mr. Mercer. Justice. Slow, ugly paperwork justice, the only kind that ever sticks. He looked at Pierce, slumped on the third horse. That, he said, is Sheriff Edmund Pierce. Yes, Marshal. You are returning him alive. Yes, Marshal. Why? Caleb glanced at Della. Because he said my wife told him on the floor of our cabin that there was no kindness in the room for him. There was only the law, and the law is colder than the snow that almost killed him. We thought we would let the law have him marshal the way we promised our sister Maribel we would. Marshal Cyrus Dawson, who had ridden 11 days through bad weather to keep a 29-year promise to a schoolmate, took off his hat and held it against his chest for a moment. That, he said, is the right answer. The trial was held in the second week of February 1888. It was not held in the saloon. It was held in the territorial courthouse at Cheyenne with 3 federal judges on the bench instead of the one Holloway had bribed for years. Marshal Dawson stood in the back of the courtroom for every day of it with his hat in his hands and 20 marshals at his shoulders. Della Mercer sat in the front row in her crimson velvet dress with Caleb on one side of her and Silas on the other. They sat through every hour of every day. They listened while a federal prosecutor read the names from her father's ledger one by one. They listened while 2 territorial judges took the stand and confessed to bribes rather than face the gallows. They listened while United States Senator Hiram Plow of Wyoming Territory was named in absentia and stripped of his seat by telegram from Washington. Edmund Pierce was hanged on the 11th of March, 1888, in the public square at Cheyenne. He went to the gallows without speaking. He was 47 years old. He had taken $500 in May of 1885 to burn a homestead in Absaroka County. He had outlived the 7-year-old girl who slept in that house by 2 years and 10 months. He did not deserve more than that. Mayor Jubal Holloway had outlived Maribel Mercer by exactly 34 months when the avalanche took him. His body was recovered when the snow melted in May. He was buried in a pauper's grave in South Pass City. No stone was placed. No name was given. His ranch and his bank and his fortune of $200,000 were divided by federal court order among the 11 families whose homesteads he had burned. The Mercer family received 1/11th share. They did not need it. They gave it to Beatrice Whitmore, who used it to start a school for the children of the burned families. The school stood for 41 years. The school still stands today. That is what justice looks like, friends. It is not lightning. It is not a bullet. It is paperwork and telegrams and 3 federal judges in a courthouse in Cheyenne. But when it sticks for 41 years. 41 years of a schoolhouse paid for by the money of the man who burned the children's parents. That is what the Lord does when men give him room to work. Hold that close, friends. Hold it close. The Mercer family did not stay at Dead Man's Drop. They could not. The canyon held too many ghosts now. Maribel under her cottonwood tree, the graves of Eliza and Jonas under the ponderosa pine on the old homestead a few miles east. 40 paid gunmen still buried somewhere under the long flat plain of snow that had been their canyon floor. Pierce's blood on the splitting block. Holloway's ring on the hand of a body that would not be found until May. In April, with the snow softening in the lower valleys, the 3 of them rode south. Caleb on his black Mustang, Silas on hardtack, Della on Hazel. They carried what could be carried on 3 horses. They left the cabin standing because the cabin had earned the right to stand, but they did not look back at it as they rode out of the canyon for the last time. They settled at Wind River Valley. It was a wide green basin 2 days south of Lander with a clear creek running through the middle of it and good grass for cattle and a stand of cottonwoods at the south end. large enough to build a house under. Caleb and Silas built that house through the spring and summer of 1888. It had 4 rooms, then 6 rooms, then by the end of the year, 8 rooms. It had a wide porch on the east side that faced the morning sun and a wide porch on the west side that faced the evening sun. It had cedar shingles. It had glass windows. It had a stone fireplace at each end of the great room, large enough for a tall man to stand inside. It was a home. It was not a fortress. It would never need to be a fortress. Silas married Beatrice Whitmore on the 3rd of June, 1889. He was 33. She was 52. They had no children of their own, but they took in 2 boys from the orphanage at Lander who had lost their parents in one of the burned homesteads, and they raised those boys as their own sons. The older boy became a lawyer in Cheyenne. The younger boy became a Methodist preacher in Casper. They were both proud men. Silas lived to see them both married. He died in 1917 at the age of 61 with his wife's hand in his and a Bible open on his chest. He went easy. The Lord had been waiting for him. Caleb and Della had 2 children. Their son, Hollis Mercer, named for Della's father, was born in the spring of 1890. He had his mother's cornflower blue eyes and his father's broad shoulders and his Uncle Silas's quick laugh. He grew up to run the Wind River Valley Ranch. Their daughter, Maribel Tess Mercer, was born in the spring of 1892. The first name was for Caleb's lost sister. The middle name was for Della's own grandmother in Boston, whom she had loved as a child. She had her father's whiskey amber eyes and her mother's honey-colored hair. She grew up to teach school in Lander, where the children loved her for the same reason every child has ever loved a good teacher, which is that she saw them. Marshall Cyrus Dawson retired in 1892 at the age of 64. He moved to a small cabin on the Mercer Ranch at Wind River Valley, where Caleb had built it for him along the creek. He spent his last years fishing in the creek and reading aloud to the Mercer children. They called him Granddad Cyrus. He died in the winter of 1901 with both children sitting beside his bed reading to him in turns from the Book of Psalms. He was buried under the cottonwoods at the south end of the property next to a small wooden cross that read Hollis Hartwell, Boston, in honor of the man whose ledger had made it all possible. In December of 1893, the year their daughter turned 1 and their son turned 3, Caleb and Della sat together on the east porch of the Wind River house with a wool blanket across their laps and watched the first snow of the season fall on the valley. Caleb was 37, Della was 28. They had been married for 6 years. Silas and Beatrice were riding over from Lander for Christmas supper, and their 2 boys were riding with them. Cyrus Dawson was already in the kitchen making coffee. Hollis, the younger, was running across the yard chasing the new shepherd dog Caleb had given him for his 3rd birthday. Maribel Tess was asleep in Della's lap with one tiny hand wrapped around her mother's finger. Caleb reached out and took Della's free hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he said quietly, answering that advertisement. Della smiled. She did not look at him. She was watching their son chase the dog. I regret one thing, Caleb Mercer. What? That I did not write the letter sooner. 6 years we have had. We could have had 7. Caleb closed his eyes. He did not speak. He did not need to. Outside, the first snow of the season came down on the cottonwoods at the south end of the valley where Hollis Hartwell's wooden cross stood beside Marshall Cyrus Dawson's small cabin. Some of the snow fell on the cross. Some of the snow fell on Maribel Mercer's grave many miles to the north under her cottonwood by the creek that ran into Dead Man's Drop. Some of the snow fell on Eliza and Jonas Mercer's graves under the ponderosa pine where they had been buried in 1882. Some of the snow fell on the pauper's grave of Mayor Jubal Holloway where no name had ever been placed. Some of the snow fell on the schoolhouse Beatrice Whitmore had built with Holloway's money, where 11 children were learning to read by the light of a wood stove. All of it was the same snow. The Lord does not waste snow any more than he wastes pain. And somewhere friends on a porch swing in the high country of Wyoming on a December evening in 1893, a man who had thought he would die alone in 1882 was holding the hand of a woman who had thought she would die alone in 1887. 6 years of marriage, 2 children, a brother and sister-in-law on horseback coming over the rise, an old marshal in the kitchen making coffee, a dog chasing a small boy through the snow, a baby girl asleep in her mother's lap. The mountain don't keep what it doesn't want, but what it keeps, oh friends, what it keeps, and that, my friends, is how a woman everyone in Boston had forgotten became the woman a mountain decided to keep. That is how two brothers who had thought their family was buried under the ashes of one homestead in 1885 came to sit on a porch in 1893 with their wives and their children and their old friend Marshall Cyrus Dawson all gathered around them for Christmas supper. That is how a ledger that weighed 7 pounds and was bound in calfskin became a schoolhouse that stood for 41 years. This is old Jeb. I have been telling the story for 40 years. I will tell it again next winter, the Lord willing, and the winter after that. There are folks who say the West has been told too many times. I do not believe them. As long as there are two broken people in this world who do not yet know they belong together, as long as there are mayors with gold rings on their hands, as long as there are quiet accountants who choose honesty over their own lives, as long as there are women who can shoot a Sharps buffalo rifle at 200 yards with steady hands, as long as there are brothers who keep promises to their dead sisters, as long as there are mountains that listen, the story is worth telling, the Lord is worth thanking, and the snow, my friends, keeps falling. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright, keep your powder dry. And remember that the mountain don't keep what it doesn't want, but what it keeps forever. Go in peace, friends. Old Jeb will see you next time at the campfire.